Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. Hope you had a good party last night. I see a lot of tired faces, which is good, which means you had a good time. I did. Good morning. My name is Mike Chichi. I'm the AVP of Architecture in Appian's Customer Success.
And I'm Caroline Brodigan. I'm a Senior Manager in Product Management, focusing on DevOps.
And today we're going to talk about successful Agile delivery with Appian. So this morning I was going to open something different, but this morning, I put my new suit on, and I was really happy with it. I got it tailored. I just had a 40th birthday, and when I went to the tailor, I went a few times. He was nipping and tucking and getting my feedback, and I'm like, well, that's kind of like what I do, right? There's feedback from the business. He was building my suit. He had a rough draft first. And then at the end, when I tried it on, it just fit like a glove. It was amazing. I was so happy with it. And then, I put it in my closet, waited a few months for a special occasion today, right, for my launch date. In the meantime, though, I got a little sick, lost a bunch of weight, and my pants were on my ankles this morning. So all of that work, market conditions change, the situation changes, business needs change, and we got to be able to adapt to it, right? And that's why we use all the different Agile principles and different methodologies in that arena, right, to be able to respond to change, right? And so today we're going to be focusing a little bit on the deployment process, but also some of the case studies that we're going to be talking about, what different situations look like. So I had a picture here. It was actually really difficult to find a photo of a back of a caravan on an RV. But effectively, if you're going there's holidays coming up, if you go on a road trip, you get into the mountains, and even though you might have a super fast car, great tires, great handling car, if you're stuck behind an RV, you're going 20 miles an hour, right? And no matter how well your car works, you can't go faster than that. And it's the same thing, you might be using Scrum, you might be using Kanban, you have all these best practices implemented at your organization. But if one of the pieces does not work the way that it should, you're going to be like a driver stuck behind a caravan, right? If your QA cycles take 6 weeks to get completed, you're not going to be agile because you're going to have to wait. So today we're going to cover like what good looks like, what is the kind of the happy path, and then we're going to throw some wrenches into the process and see what happens and how you can adjust your cycles with Appian. With that, Caroline, kick us off.
Yeah. So just a brief agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what CI/CD features look like in Appian today. And then, as Mike said, he's going to walk us through a couple of these case studies about how does your road look and what vehicles might be on it. And then we'll just wrap up and send you all off to the live build. So I always like to maybe do a little bit of context setting. I know we've had a lot of talk about Agile in different sessions, and so most people are, I'm sure, familiar with it. But a little refresher on the fundamentals. So, we're talking about successful Agile delivery here. That's really around removing process barriers. We're focused on building working software quickly, thinking about how to collaborate with your customers throughout the entire life cycle, and not just at the end when you throw it over the wall. And in the theme of the conference, responding to change, perhaps even orchestrating it, rather than resisting it or trying to run away from it. Now we talked about Agile. The other thing that we have in this description, we were talking about CI/CD. So CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery. Your continuous integration is really about building things incrementally. So, and the reason we do that is to try and reduce risk and improve quality. So pull those risks to the right, pull them earlier, find out what's not working, and fix it faster. Continuous delivery on the other side is about releasing frequently. So why do we build these things? It's ultimately to deliver business value. We want users to be successful. We want the businesses to run better. So by releasing more frequently, we get that user value out to the people who are actually doing the business quickly, efficiently, and we get the feedback that we need to improve it. So now, what do these two things have in common? Agile and CI/CD, and we throw DevOps in the mix too. They're both about removing barriers. Agile takes a focus a little bit more on process and people. CI/CD focuses a little bit more on how to do that with tools and automation. But ultimately, they're both prioritizing some of these things we touched on already. Speed, working software, all with an ultimate goal of user value. So just wanted to context that a little bit before we jump right into the demos and the product demonstrations and some of these use cases as we, then jump in. So CI/CD and Appian. Our typical pipeline setup consists of 3 environments at the most basic level. So you've got your development, your test, and your production. Now, these are all connected through what we call the DevOps infrastructure in Appian. So this is a place in your administration console where it's the foundation of many of the features that I'm going to talk about today, where you can connect these environments, set up a pipeline for them to communicate with one another, and then govern what they are allowed to do. So here we can see these 3 environments. I'm in production. I've got it connected to development and test. And I can say which environments are allowed to deploy to each other. So, I want development to maybe be able to reach out to production to see some monitoring information, but I don't want to send deployments directly from dev to prod. But from test, that's okay. So here I can make decisions about what's allowed, have the product enforce those, and enable features like automatic deployments, whether or not those require approval, whether I allow it externally from APIs that I'll talk a lot about later on, and really just set the foundation for how your teams are operating. Now, Agile, we talked about empowering individuals, but those individuals are all part of a team. So when you're building software, it's not a solo endeavor. So in Appian, one of the things that we do for continuous integration is tracking work in packages to facilitate that teamwork. So here, you can create a package and see descriptions of the different work, the different tickets that are being underway, and then work with other people on your team to complete that functionality. I can even go so far as to upload database scripts, track plugins, and import customization files, all the different things that I might need to effectively make this change, and make it really a breeze that later on when it comes to deployment, I don't have to go track down people, send emails, call after hours. Everything is centrally located and available to anyone who wants to come do a review or do the deployment. Now we're talking about, again, individuals and teams. So I think one of the really important parts with continuous integration is what tools do you have to centrally audit information. So you have a bunch of different people who are building. You want to ensure a consistent level of quality. You want to have some checks and balances. You need to have peer reviewers. And one of the tools that Appian provides is the security summary. So this is a place where you can, across an application, see your security settings for all of your objects, centrally manage them, and make sure that the right people have access to the right things. So this goes from your backend, which data objects people have access to the front-end user experience. So who can see different sites, who can see different actions. Another one of these tools that enables kind of central visibility and auditability is comparing changes. So this is something that you can do both across environments and across versions. And it's really focused on giving that visibility. When you're working with other people, maybe you're not quite sure what they were doing, what's left to do. Did they do the thing in the most effective way or change it in a different way? So comparisons give you a visual way across all your object types to see what is the impact of a deployment that you might be making. Or if you're troubleshooting maybe a bug, you could go into versions and see what's changed since the last time that I saw this working. Now we've been building, we've been tracking our work, we've been validating some of those changes. Now we come to testing. So there's 2 types of testing that I'd like to talk about today. The first is unit testing. So as you're building, automating that testing with Appian's native expression rule test cases. Again, on that theme of central management and auditability, the managed test cases dialog is a great place for your application to see across all the objects inside there, which ones have test cases, which ones don't, which ones are passing, which ones are failing, which ones maybe haven't been run in a while that we should check on, and you can execute them in bulk from here. This is a great tool as you're building and maybe as you're like a team lead who's keeping an eye or a quality lead. But But you can also run these in bulk from an application, from a process model, even hook it up to a web API and run it from another tool. So, really getting your team members to buy into to building quality along the way and making sure that test cases reflect the functionality that a rule should be delivering. And it wouldn't be an Appian rule breakout without a mention of AI. So one of the ways that we're making this easier in 24.2 is with Developer Copilot and automated suggestions for test cases. So here we've asked the Developer Copilot to generate some test cases that they think would be valuable or make sense for this particular expression rule. And then I, as the developer, can choose which of those I think make sense. Do I want to have some of them? Do I think all of them are good to persist into the rule? And then build that into my cycle where I'm running them in bulk. Other people are coming in to test after they've made a change to this rule, and they can ensure that it's still working the way it was intended, or update the test case. Now, the second type of testing that we wanted to talk about is functional testing. So this allows you to automate tests that mimic what an end user is seeing. So browser-based testing tools, and these are all available on the app market, and they're really about mimicking that user experience and testing kind of the deeper flows of your application beyond those smaller unit tests that we just talked about. Now, we made Selenium a little bit bigger to make sure people know that it's there because it's a more recent one. But the benefit of these app market ones is that they are backwards compatible. So if you're using a Selenium-based testing tool, if you have other tools in your ecosystem, your quality team can use. Anytime that Appian releases new components and a new release of our software, we make sure that these tools know how to communicate with kind of the base UI layer for Appian. So you're not rewriting your tests every upgrade of Appian. So we really would encourage people to take a look at these. And as with anything, we're talking about Agile. You don't want to set out to try and automate every UI, every flow from the beginning in a large mass. So you want to think about things that are high frequency, high risk. Again, you're thinking from the user's perspective. What are the flows that are maybe most valuable, most visible? Start there, automate some tests, get them running regularly, see some value, build momentum. So now we've talked a lot about continuous integration. Remember, we were talking about how to do things incrementally, building, validating, testing. Now the other side of that, continuous delivery. How are we getting that value out to customers? So first, I wanted to highlight native CI/CD with one-click deployments. So here we have our compare and deploy wizard, which is natively built into Appian, using that infrastructure we configured, and pulling in all of those objects that we put into our packages. So as other people have queued them up, I can come in here and it automatically grabs my database scripts, my plugins. It does a series of validation checks. In this case, I know those warnings are actually covered by the database scripts. And it automatically populates my information about my ticket. So what was the point of this change? What functionality is it delivering? I know it went by a little quickly, which is the intention. But with that one click, I've pushed all that functionality into the test environment. And then from there, I can actually reuse that deployment and push it up to production once it's been validated by the QA team. And if I have any questions about what was the status, what was included, I can always come back and audit those deployments through our deploy view. So this contains a history of all the deployments, the method, who made the request, when it was executed, and what objects were included. So now we talked a little bit about that as our kind of native CI/CD one-click. It's a great place to get started. A lot of customers definitely prioritize using it from their dev to their test environments, but we know oftentimes production is more highly regulated. And so in addition to what we call those direct deployments, we also have external deployments. So these are a series of REST APIs that allow you to orchestrate Appian within your larger CI/CD pipeline using a tool of your choice. I have a little animation here to call out that based on customer use cases and feedback last year, we added export APIs in addition to the inspect and deployment APIs so that we could kind of automate that last piece of the puzzle and round out the story. So please, if you're using these, we'd love to hear your feedback, how they're working for you. But these are kind of two different tracks, depending on your use cases, depending on your skill sets, that are both equally supported and encouraged from the platform. Okay, so we've built, we've tested, we've deployed, and now functionality is in users' hands and we're done, right? Yeah, right. Not quite. So, we wanted to make sure that we have user value. So if things are incredibly slow, if things are erroring, have we really delivered that user value that we were shooting for? I would say no. And I'm sure that you probably hear from your users when things are slow. But in case you don't, or if you have a very large user base, there's a set of monitoring tools built directly into Appian that let your developer or your operations teams kind of proactively look out for hotspots. So recently, in 24.1, we released this new query monitoring view. And in 24.2, we're enhancing it so that, again, using that environment infrastructure, you can compare across environments. So from your developer environment, you can actually look at how some of these queries are running in production. It might be a little small, but all of the information is obfuscated. So you're not seeing usernames, you're not seeing customer data, you're seeing objects that you have access to, you're seeing UUIDs that offer traceability without exposing information. Another one is record response time usage. So again, what is the user's experience of your records? Data Fabric is a super powerful feature. We hope everybody's building their applications based on it. And as you're building out those interfaces, you want to understand, again, what's the user experience? How are those queries and other integrations all rolling up into an overall response time? So this is another one of those monitoring views that you can see across environments. You can see in an individual environment. And you can use to ensure that you have a good user experience. And the last one, so I know we get a lot of asks about alerting, and I'm happy to say that we've introduced alerting last year on portals, and coming in 24.2, we're also going to add alerting on sites. So the main two ways that users interact with your application from a UI perspective, you can both monitor your portals through a new monitoring view, but the administrators of those objects that you've set up in your security summary will now also get emails when someone encounters an error in production so that you can jump in, troubleshoot it, and figure out what the right fix is to put back into your CI/CD pipeline. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about case studies and what this looks like in different team settings and customer projects, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Caroline. So before we get into the paths, and we'll cover kind of the happy path and some alternative paths, we need to talk about prerequisites. So in order to have a successful Agile delivery, you will, and especially with a low-code team, you need a small cross-functional team. No more than 6-7 members. Any more than that, the communication starts to really break down. You're having effectively every new member is a exponential multiplier of the communication paths that need to happen within the team. So you really need to keep the team small. The other thing that we recommend, and that's especially true for Appian, and that's how we set up our customer success teams, is that we're looking for a profile for effectively a cross-functional team member. They're developers and. So the and could be a UX designer and a DB specialist. So that way, what's happening here is that with the developer and profile, what you do is, with a low-code platform like ours, right? You don't need a specialist, right? You don't need a specialist Java developer. You can cross-train folks from different backgrounds, UX, database, maybe business analysis, right? Cross-train them on Appian, and now they can be both designers and have a specialty somewhere else. This represents a cost saving both from a labor perspective, right? Because now we have fewer people involved in the project delivery, but also from a product perspective, because deeply collaborative cross-functional teams can create the best product and build the right product together with your business team. Additionally, what you're looking for, in traditional development approaches, your business analyst might act as a translator between users and technology teams, right? But here, again, because you have folks who are, you might have a member of the team or multiple members of the team with a business analysis background, right? They can be the interfaces and help the team collaborate deeply with the business. Additionally, right, you need, your QA team needs to be deeply involved in the process from the get-go, right? The QA cycle cannot be more than, if you're using Scrum, it cannot be more than a sprint behind, and we'll get to that why in a little bit later. We talked about the close business collaboration. So the developers, right, really need to understand what the business use case and the business needs at an in-depth level, right? That way they can build the right product. But the flip side is also important, right? The business needs to understand the capability, and so that way they can envision what the future might look like. If you were here for the Merck session earlier today, they talked about that initially, the SMEs and the business users, they didn't know what could be, what's the art of the possible. So they didn't know even what to ask for. So as they learned more about Appian and about the process, they started figuring out, and they started bringing use cases and solutions, right, to the development team. The other thing that's important is that team needs to provide feedback early and often, right? If they're not involved, throughout the sprint delivery, then again, you're just at the end of your release, you might end up with a suit that doesn't fit, right? And yeah, I talked about no middle people. So your business analysts become effectively a bottleneck if they're translating everything between the business, and your developers, and they become, you're losing things in translation, right? So what the local platform allows you to do from an Appian perspective, right, and from your application development perspective, is to really connect and start molding these two, seemingly siloed operations together. And last but not least, you need an easy deployment process with minimal overhead, right? This is important going from dev to test when you're doing small packages, story-based packages that developers are pushing to test on an ongoing basis. The QA team can keep moving, right? They can unit test everything, really quickly. They can see the integration testing within in-sprint or, at most a sprint behind. You also need regular prod deployments, to keep releases small and manageable. The bigger the release, the more testing there is, the more validation that you need to do. But also, as you're releasing frequently, 6 to 8 weeks, maybe sometimes even more frequently if you're that agile, it keeps the end users engaged, right? Because there's new things flowing in. There's always something new. There might be some quality of life improvements that you're adding, and then they can pay it back with additional feedback. So it's really important to kind of keep things moving. And obviously, at the end, use, compare, and deploy. We will always recommend to use the Appian built-in process. It's the easiest. It's the fastest. If you have an automated external pipeline, and like since 23.3, that story is now complete. From soup to nuts, that can be completely automated. Again, the point is here for minimum overhead. If you start adding slowdowns into the process, you're effectively putting an RV on the road. Okay, so what does a happy path look like, right? So when you have a well-oiled machine, what does the process look like? All right, so you have frequent incremental patches deployed from development to test at the story level. QA can test it, within in-sprint, or sometimes they do it, they develop the scripts in sprint and they do their testing the sprint behind. And then once you're ready, once you're entering your pre-release sprint, you can take a full application and then move that to your UAT environment, for a final both integration testing and your UAT cycle. I do recommend the fourth environment, so that's the staging environment, the deployment test, however you want to call this. I talked about it at Appian World last year. You can review the session then. Why I think it's absolutely necessary. So once you have your release candidate, everything is tested, you're good and ready. You take the same package that you just deployed to your deployment test, and you push that into production. Job done, right? That's kind of, using compare and deploy. You can see that whole pipe. going through. You can reuse packages like Caroline mentioned earlier. So that is super simple and straightforward, and that's how your Agile delivery should really look like. However, that almost never happens. There's always something, there's always a wrench in the works. And we'll go through some of the use cases, right, and some of the situations. So what are the sad paths, right? What are the alternative paths? So as an example, I see oftentimes that QA team is understaffed, and they just cannot keep up with the amount of work that the development team is churning out, right? Especially like we're talking about a low-code environment. When you're just starting your journey, you might be thinking, hey, there's going to be maybe a few stories per sprint. Well, with the customer success teams, they churn out a ton of functionality, and the QA team needs to reflect that. So otherwise, you're just going to be again, you're going to be the people in the van are going to be happy, but you're going to be in the back, not so much. So what can you do with this, right? One, you could slow down, right? So that's not exactly desirable, but you could de-staff the development team and then just slow down. Not ideal, not something that we want to see, right? Ultimately, this is a resourcing issue. You need to add QA staff to be able to keep up with that, or change your practices. There might be some additional procedural things that you might be able to do to address this. What if your business users never seen the application, right? And there's official UAT cycle, and unfortunately that happens very frequently. And now, one, they have a ton of feedback because this is the first time they've seen it. Two, you might have just built the wrong thing because you've never solicited that feedback, right? And your developers going into the UAT cycle are just going into the fog, right? Completely not knowing like how that's gonna, what that's gonna end up being. And then coming in from that UAT cycle, now you have a ton of work that developers need to potentially address, right? To ensure that the product is actually ready for production. So again, business users need to be involved early and often, right? There needs to be a melding of minds, because otherwise, how do you know that you're building the right thing, right? Your developers might be adhering to best practices, they're building the thing right, but it might be a completely something that the business doesn't need. And then finally, what if there's especially in pharma or in other regulated industries, your processes might not actually start until you code complete. What does code complete really mean? In an Agile delivery setting, I'm not sure, but effectively, you have to freeze your release and then just sit and wait until someone else does their job. That's not ideal, right? Like you don't want your development teams to be sitting on their hands waiting for some feedback to trickle down maybe 6 weeks later. And unfortunately, these are policy-related issues. I've seen validation teams, from a GXP perspective, get involved much earlier, right? So that they can also start building documentation, and then when you enter your pre-release sprint, they can only just do incremental changes. But that's not always possible, right? And what do? You're stuck. Your pipe is clogged, and you can't move forward. Some things that you might be able to do: use feature toggles, right? So you start to use your release 1 is frozen. You might be able to hide some things for release 2, right? That's not always going to be possible if things are too interrelated, but that's one technique that we use. The other thing is you could potentially shorten the release cycle, right? So that way the release is more manageable, right? Like, and the amount of validation that they need to do is also shorter, right? Like, so effectively you're shortening those cycles. However, in extreme situations, right, like release 2 just cannot start until UAT and validation cycles are complete, and the release 1 code is in production. So this is especially problematic in regulated industries. I do a lot of life sciences work, and unfortunately that is sometimes the case. So what do? No, Appian does not support branching. But we do branching through another environment, right? Like, there's no built-in branching into the product. You effectively have to fork your code base to a different environment, right? So you have your dev 1 and test 1 are frozen, and what you do is you need a dev 2 and test 2. So you deploy your changes, your code base into dev 2, and you continue normally. right? So you develop as you go the same way with the test cycles going on. And then once all of this is done, production is, release 1 is in production and with the users. You then port back from your test environment back to dev 1 and test 1. This is an extreme example. I do not recommend anybody just be like, okay, we can do this. We can do branching. As a best practice, we recommend what we call trunk-based development, where you have a single cycle, single stream. This is really when you're blocked, right? Because there's some blockers, right, that you can't go around. We have some tools in terms of diff, in terms of environment comparisons across the different environments that are helpful in doing the merge, right, and making sure that the code that you bring in from release 2 to release 1 is working. But that process is still very painful. Even in high code situations where you have products that support branching and merging, even that is not easy, right, to ensure that the end result is actually working code. All right. I think, Caroline, if you could wrap up.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Mike. So we're almost done. We just wanted to kind of summarize again. So we talked a little bit about Agile. We talked about CI/CD. We looked at some ways that Appian features support that CI/CD lifecycle in terms of both individuals working and team-level visibility. I think one thing Mike touched on is that low code really offers some different patterns for Agile delivery versus high code. And so instead of trying to take maybe some of the high code practices and force them into the low code pants, think about what are some better ways to take advantage of the benefits and take some of maybe the principles or really inspiration for solutions. So take advantage of what works really well. And then finally, you just want to make sure that all parts of your delivery machine are working together. So the team, that people perspective from Agile. So bringing your quality team in, bringing your customers in, shortening feedback loops. It's people who make the software, so it's an important part. Leaving from this session, I know we usually recommend some other sessions that would be good to go to, but we are rapidly at the end of the conference. So we'd like to point everybody to community. That's a great place to continue learning if you're not already a member. And then maybe a example in extreme Agile, the live build challenge. I know they've been doing a number of breakout small build challenges to continuously integrate throughout the last couple of days. And they're going to bring it all together to deliver some value, hopefully, right after this at 2:30 in the Maryland Ballroom. But in addition, I think we have about 5 minutes for questions, and we have a mic. So if people, yes, wonderful.
So just the question is the package a unit of delivery for Appian? I mean, basically, when we're deploying changes, the package that we create defines the unit of delivery, and a collection of packages is what a release would be?
Yes, so, okay, it's still on, great. So package is a unit of work, yes. And what typically happens when you move it across an environment is your package isn't a object that we want to persist long-term. It becomes a deployment. So it was like the way that you're tracking the in-progress work, and then once it's in the next environment, it's a deployment that can be reused. But to Mike's point about the release packages, there's tools to combine packages. So if you've got all your individual tickets, you can roll them up into a release that then represents.
Just one more question is that when we suppose use Jenkins or some other way to automate our deployments or the pipeline, in that case, that release that you just mentioned becomes what we move around? Is that what we call upon? Because when we're externally calling into deployments, how do we identify the build or the release component?
Yep, exactly. So okay, we might have to go pretty far back. But so when we were looking at, it's gonna be a while. Okay, sorry, all these builds. Here. So the manual steps at the beginning are where you're the person's actually doing the development and tracking their work. So a developer still needs to choose what's meaningful to be part of that functionality. But then once that merge to master step that we talked about, that's where you can then point at a package or point at a full application and automatically export it. So You can trigger into Jenkins that we have APIs that let you retrieve the packages for an application and search through them through filters. So that's really the way that we see people kind of pulling packages or pulling a full app, depending on maybe how much work you have in flight or how large a team it is.
And if you want to see an example of a seamless, fully automated pipeline, Richard Sean did a presentation on Monday during the Dev Day on Azure DevOps, and he's released the scripts. So I do recommend if you watch the video. It's really, it just shows what the powerful tools we've put together in APIs.
So less technical question, but as far as a team tool or ticketing system, I think you kind of showed some screens earlier with the packages, but say you're used to using like, Jira or even Azure DevOps for your ticketing purposes. Is there anywhere within Appian where you can take care of that? You can open up a ticket, have acceptance criteria, release, sprint, everything. Is that all available within the app somewhere?
Good question. We've gotten the request to have a more like direct integration, I guess. It sounds like maybe you're thinking about like I can create a ticket from Appian. We actually use Jira internally in the engineering department as well for requirements tracking. And I'd say for packages, it's a little bit of a lighter touch where we give you a way to track URLs, kind of generically a URL for a ticket. And then carry that traceability throughout the deployment. In terms of forward flow, I think there's an app market connected system where you can integrate with Jira, and we've actually built some things where you can create tickets from Appian, but we don't have a out-of-the-box deep integration right now.
Yeah, so I might have two questions. The first part is I'm in life sciences, so that problem case is right up my alley. So the question about that is, I know out of the box it's the first 3 environments. How do you get this next 2 environments? And then the second question is, we use 2-week sprint cycles within our company. When I hear low code, I'm thinking fast, so we can deploy just immediately and not take the 2 weeks. But what does Agile look like in the Appian world?
Sure. So first, you have to pay for it. So the 4th environment, the extra 2, obviously in those situations, the problem is solved with money. Regarding the sprint cycles, within customer success, we recommend 2-week sprints. And the reason for that is that it's not just the dev team, but it's also the business teams, it's also the testing teams. Anything, any longer than that, usually the kind of the individual sprint work gets just too large, right? For requirements gathering, for refinement, things like that. But any shorter than that, you're not really able to deliver anything kind of value in that such a short period of time. So 2 weeks is, the last 5 years we've been doing just 2 weeks.
Yeah. And I guess I'd just tack on that in engineering, we also do 2-week sprints. And we've tried with 1 week before, but I think the other thing that you run into is that Agile's not without process. And so sometimes the overhead for some of the planning and the validation, when you're in 1-week sprint, it can kind of overshadow the focus. Yeah.
Hi, this is Dinesh from Westpac. This is good. Thank you for that. So I have 2 questions. One is we have this issue that while we are building very fast, and you qualified that as well, QA is almost always a bottleneck. So you suggested that automation and staffing more is one of the options. The thing that we get blocked into is this performance testing, which requires a lot of data and all that. So how do you solve for that problem? So that's number 1. Part 2 of the question is, as someone was saying in the front as well, we have this regulatory requirement where we cannot use Appian's internal versioning system. We have to take the version out into our system, so we are using your APIs to do that. But then when it comes to, we have to literally run something to export stuff out. We don't have anything that like in a high code environment, you have those versioning tool that automatically do the syncing. So is there something in the pipeline where you have something like that where we can automatically get the code out as the developers are writing into our versioning environment?
I'll take the first one, maybe you can take the second one. So regarding performance testing, yes, performance testing cycles are longer than just 2 weeks, and in majority of cases. Usually what we do on our end, right, like you can't really wait until the final product. So we usually start the performance testing cycle a little earlier once kind of the core of the product is built, right? Because the performance test doesn't necessarily you don't have to test every single piece of functionality. Right? You're checking the major paths, right? Like, and you're ensuring that the volumes and the loads that you're putting on the system are representative of future production usage. So usually you just have to start a little bit earlier and just plan it out. Yeah, it's not super straightforward, but ultimately, you don't want to wait at the end once the product is done, because yeah, things change. Maybe 2 months later, once your performance test is done, new requirements come up, right? So there's usually you just start a little earlier.
Yeah, and I think we do offer another app market. I know I mentioned Fitness and Selenium and Cucumber, but there's also Locust as a performance testing library that's supported with Appian. And I think back in the day we have JMeter, but I know a lot of people.
But the Appian, if you're doing performance testing, Appian Locust library is I think at this point the best, right? Like if you don't have a standard tool in your organization, I do recommend Appian Locust. And then the last one was about exporting. So we do have, I don't know if Caroline, if you want to take that.
We can go back all the way. So it sounded like maybe you were thinking about like exporting as people were developing, like even more frequently. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, with the export APIs, which are relatively newer, like you could do it. I don't know, like at any sort of time, but again, it needs to be triggered by something, and we don't have. I don't think we have a way that you could like tap into a save of an object, because in most cases we would say that's not guaranteed. It's a meaningful change that you want to put into version control. Hopefully people are saving more frequently as they develop, and then there's a certain point where they say, okay, now those changes are ready. So I think with the export APIs, there might be a way to get close to what you are looking for, but not maybe as real time as you're seeing. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I think we have to wrap up questions here, but if you want to have some more, we can
Thank you so much.
take them outside.